It was supposed to be a routine traffic stop, but what happened next was anything but ordinary. A black woman, calm and composed, found herself face to face with a police officer whose anger was palpable from the start. The tension was thick, his tone sharp, and the power dynamic painfully clear. She could have yelled, argued, or walked away, but what she chose to do instead was something no one expected. Her response, bold and unconventional, didn't just shift the energy of the moment, it sparked a change so profound it would alter the officer's perspective forever. As the situation unfolds, it becomes clear this isn't just a clash of authority and defiance. It's about humanity, understanding, and the surprising ways compassion can disarm even the deepest prejudice. What did she do to turn his world upside down? Stay tuned. It's a story you won't forget. The officer's harsh tone cut through the air as he demanded her license and registration. His eyes were cold, scanning her with suspicion that spoke louder than words. She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached for her purse with deliberate care, her calm demeanor standing in sharp contrast to his aggression. This wasn't the first time she faced this kind of hostility. As a black woman, she knew the weight of these moments, the unspoken tension that lingered in the space between authority and identity. But today felt different. She wasn't angry, she was determined. What he didn't know was that this woman had spent years advocating for equality, confronting prejudice in ways that sought to educate rather than escalate. And now, as she handed over her papers with a quiet confidence, her next move was forming in her mind. It wasn't just about her, it was about him too. As the officer scrutinized her documents, his frustration seemed to grow. He questioned her about where she was going, why she was in the area, and every answer she gave seemed to annoy him further. His voice rose, each word sharp and loaded with unnecessary authority. Onlookers began to notice, their curiosity drawing silent witnesses to the scene. She felt their eyes, but she stayed calm, refusing to match his energy. What she saw in his anger wasn't just prejudice, it was something deeper, something broken. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered someone lashing out because of their own struggles, but it still stung. And yet, she chose to focus on what she could control, her own response. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, but then she spoke, her voice steady and deliberate. Her words were unexpected, not confrontational but disarming, leaving the officer momentarily stunned. The officer stood frozen for a moment, her calm but powerful words hanging in the air. She wasn't angry or defensive. Instead, she spoke about respect, about understanding, about how their roles in this moment could define more than just themselves. Her tone wasn't accusing, it was reflective, almost challenging him to look beyond his assumptions. But her composure seemed to only frustrate him more. His face reddened, his fists clenched by his sides, and his voice grew louder, demanding she cooperate. People nearby started recording on their phones, sensing the situation was spiraling. She noticed, but didn't let it rattle her. She took a small step forward, her heart pounding, and met his glare with steady eyes. "Officer," she said, her voice steady, "what are you really fighting here? Because it's not me." The question caught him off guard, his confidence faltering just slightly. The crowd grew silent, waiting to see what would happen next. For a moment, the officer seemed a loss for words, her question cutting through his anger like a knife. But instead of calming down, he doubled down, stepping closer and towering over her. "You don't get to question me," he barked, his voice echoing across the parking lot. His words were sharp, but there was something else in his tone now, a crack in his authority, a hint of uncertainty. Before she could respond, another voice cut in from the crowd. "What's going on here?" A man in plain clothes stepped forward, flashing a badge. He was another officer, and his presence shifted the energy in an instant. The first officer stiffened, clearly caught off guard. The tension now had a new layer, a power dynamic unfolding between them. The woman watched closely, sensing an opportunity. She realized this wasn't just about one moment or one person anymore, it was something much bigger. The second officer walked closer, his calm but firm tone cutting through the tension. "What's going on here, officer?" he asked, his eyes shifting between the woman and the angry officer. The first officer hesitated, fumbling for words, his authority suddenly questioned. "She wasn't cooperating," he muttered, but his voice lacked the confidence it carried moments ago. The woman stood still, her composure unshaken, her eyes fixed on both men. The second officer turned to her. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked. She nodded, but instead of letting the moment pass, she spoke again. "I just want to understand why he's so angry at me for doing nothing wrong." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, the first officer didn't respond. The second officer looked back at his colleague, his expression stern. "Step aside. I'll handle this." As the first officer moved reluctantly, the woman noticed something unexpected. A flicker of guilt in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was there. Before she left, she turned to the first officer one last time. "I hope you think about today," she said softly. "Because I will." The crowd began to disperse, but the weight of what had happened lingered. The officer didn't reply, but as she walked away, he stood there, frozen in thought. It wasn't a loud confrontation or a grand gesture that changed the moment. It was the quiet power of her resolve. What happened next for him was uncertain, but one thing was clear: her courage had left a mark he couldn't ignore. As she drove away, the woman couldn't help but reflect on what had just unfolded. It wasn't the first time she'd faced injustice, but this time she felt something shift. She had chosen calm over chaos, empathy over anger, and in doing so, planted a seed of change, not just in the officer but in everyone who witnessed it. The officer, still standing by the roadside, replayed her words in his mind. For years he had hidden his struggles behind a badge, letting his frustrations spill over into moments like these. But today, her composure and courage had forced him to confront something he had been avoiding, himself. The crowd that had gathered slowly went back to their lives. They carried a story that would linger, a story of resilience, humanity, and the quiet power of standing firm in the face of prejudice. And that was how change truly began.